Tonight we slip into the forgotten rhythm of Tudor England's strangest killer. Boring history, perfect for dozing off. The candle beside your bed gutters low, casting restless shadows across stone walls that have witnessed 5 centuries of secrets. Outside these palace windows, London sleeps fitfully under stars that remember when sweating sickness stalked the realm like a fever dream made flesh. You feel it first as a single bead of moisture on your brow, nothing more than the warmth of heavy blankets. Surely, the great clock in the courtyard below chimes 3 times through the darkness, each bronze note hanging in air, thick with the scent of beeswax, and something else, something that makes your skin prickle with recognition you cannot name. But this is no ordinary night in Henry VIII's England. This is July 1528, and the sweat has returned to claim its due. Your breath catches, not from fear, but from the sudden weight pressing against your chest. The same pressure that felled strong men in the space of a single prayer, that emptied royal courts and silenced bustling markets with the efficiency of winter frost. In the corridor beyond your chamber door, a servant's footsteps pause, then quicken, carrying whispered words that drift through the keyhole like smoke. The sickness, it has begun again. The flame beside you trembles, sending liquid gold cascading down the candlestick's pewter stem. Each drop hardens before it falls, like time itself crystallizing around this moment when everything changes. You close your eyes and feel the great wheel of history turning, carrying you deeper into a mystery that baffled Renaissance physicians, still haunts modern medicine, a plague that killed with such swift certainty that victims often died before their bodies grew cold. Welcome to the night when Tudor England held its breath, waiting to see who would greet the dawn. Before we dive deeper into this Tudor nightmare, drop me a comment about where in the world you're tuning in from and what the clock says right now. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all here together, scattered across time zones, sharing this moment while history whispers its secrets in the dark. Settle yourself now. Pull that blanket a little higher. Let your shoulders sink into whatever softness holds you. Tonight, you're not just a listener. You're a survivor. You're going to experience what it felt like to wake in Whitehall Palace on the night the sweating sickness returned, when every breath became a negotiation with death itself. The year is 1528, and you are a minor courtier in Henry VIII's glittering, treacherous world. Your chamber sits in the palace's eastern wing, close enough to hear the king's midnight rages, far enough to avoid his morning suspicions. The walls around you have absorbed decades of whispered conspiracies, muffled sobs, and the rustle of silk against stone as ambitious souls climbed or fell from royal favor. But tonight, ambition means nothing. Tonight, survival is measured in hours. You can feel it beginning, that peculiar dampness that marks the sweat's arrival. Not the honest perspiration of summer heat or physical labor, but something altogether more sinister. Your night shift clings to skin that grows clammy, despite the July warmth, and there's a metallic taste creeping across your tongue like the memory of blood. The great clock tower chimes again, its bronze voice carrying across courtyards where peacocks roost uneasily in the darkness. 3:30 in the morning. By some cruel mathematics that Tudor physicians never fully understood, you have perhaps 7 hours before the sickness either releases you or claims you entirely. 7 hours to navigate the most mysterious plague in English history. In the corridor outside your door, you hear it, the soft pad of bare feet on stone, moving too quickly for servants going about their normal duties. Someone else is awake. Someone else knows what's coming. The knowledge spreads through the palace like ripples in dark water, person to person, room to room, carrying the weight of shared terror and the slim hope that this time might be different. Your breathing steadies as you listen to the night sounds of a court in crisis. Somewhere, a woman weeps. Somewhere else, a man prays in Latin, his voice cracking on words that feel inadequate against the approaching dawn. These are the hours when masks fall away, when the elaborate theater of Tudor politics dissolves into something far more primitive, the simple, desperate desire to see another sunrise. Roll your shoulders back, Let the tension flow out of your neck. We're going to walk through this together, hour by hour, heartbeat by heartbeat. We're going to discover what it truly meant to face the sweating sickness when medicine was prayer, when survival was chance, and when the difference between life and death could be measured in the space of a single fevered night. The candle flame dances lower. The clock prepares to chime again, and somewhere in the darkness beyond your window, Tudor England holds its breath, waiting to see who will be left standing when the sun finally rises over a kingdom transformed by sweat and fear. The clock tower's bronze voice fades into silence, leaving only the whisper of your own breath against the still air. 4 o'clock approaches, and with it comes the unmistakable knowledge that something fundamental has shifted in your body's ancient rhythms. You wake, though you cannot remember falling asleep, to find your linen night shift damp against your spine. Not the gradual moisture of dreams or summer heat, but something immediate and strange, as if your skin has decided to weep without your permission. The sensation creeps along your shoulders like cold fingers, tracing the map of your mortality. In the darkness beyond your chamber, Whitehall Palace breathes differently tonight. The usual sounds have changed. Instead of the soft snores of sleeping courtiers and the distant clatter of kitchen servants preparing for dawn, there's an alertness in the air, the particular tension that comes when predators circle just beyond the firelight. Your hand moves to your throat, finding the pulse there rapid and shallow. This is how it begins, according to the whispered accounts that survive from previous outbreaks, not with dramatic collapse or visible plague marks, but with this creeping dampness that seems to rise from somewhere deeper than skin, somewhere closer to the soul. The first bead of sweat traces a cool path down your temple, and you understand with crystalline clarity why they call it the sweat, rather than fever or plague. This moisture carries weight, the weight of stories cut short, of ambitions dissolved, of love letters never written, and prayers never finished. Each drop holds the concentrated essence of time running out. Through your window, you glimpse movement in the courtyard below. Figures in night robes cross between shadows, their movements urgent but silent. Even at this distance, you can see the telltale shine on their faces, the way moonlight catches moisture that shouldn't be there. The sickness spreads through the palace, like spilled wine through fine cloth, darkening everything it touches. A soft knock echoes against your chamber door. 3 taps. Pause. 3 more. The signal your serving girl uses when bringing late-night messages that cannot wait for dawn. But when you call softly for her to enter, the door remains closed. Instead, you hear her voice through the thick oak, trembling with an emotion you've never heard from her before. "My lord," she whispers, "the physician comes. He says we must not open doors tonight unless someone calls your name 3 times clear." The sweat travels on breath, he thinks, on the very air between us. You lie still, processing this information as another bead of moisture slides along your collarbone. The royal physician, that pompous man with his elaborate theories about humors and planetary alignments, has been reduced to the same superstitious precautions as any village-wise woman. When learned men abandon their books for folklore, you know the enemy has shown its true face. The serving girl's footsteps retreat down the corridor, but not before you hear what she was trying not to say. The wet sound of her own breathing, the slight catch in her voice that speaks of fever climbing like ivy up a wall. She carries the sickness too, spreading it door to door, room to room, through the palace's honeycomb of ambition and fear. You close your eyes and feel the strange intimacy of sharing this plague with everyone around you. Courtiers and servants, nobles and grooms, all reduced to the same basic arithmetic of survival. In a world where birth determines everything, the sweating sickness offers a peculiar democracy. It takes whomever it pleases, whenever it pleases, without regard for titles or bloodlines or the weight of gold in your purse. The candle beside your bed burns lower, casting shifting patterns across the tapestry, that depicts some long-dead king's triumph over enemies who could never have imagined this particular defeat. Soon you'll need to light another wick, but the simple act of rising seems impossibly complex, now that every movement carries consequences you cannot predict. 7 hours until dawn, 6.5 perhaps, if the clock's bronze tongue speaks truly. Time enough for the fever to build, for the sweating to intensify, for your body to decide whether it will carry you through to another day, or surrender to whatever darkness waits beyond the morning light. The great clock speaks again, its voice carrying across courtyards, where morning should bring birdsong, but instead carries only the whispered prayers of those who fear they may not live to hear another chime. 4:30. The night deepens rather than lightens, as if dawn itself has decided to wait and see who deserves its arrival. Your fever climbs with methodical precision, degree by degree, like a tide that knows exactly how high it needs to rise. The dampness spreads from your temples down to your throat, pooling in the hollow where your pulse beats too fast, too shallow. Each breath tastes of copper and something else, something that reminds you of the way rain smells just before it breaks over parched earth. The palace shutters rattle against their latches, though no wind stirs the July air. The sound comes from within, hands pressed against windows, faces seeking cooler air that will not come. Through the walls, you hear movement that speaks of desperation, footsteps running, then stopping abruptly, doors opening and closing with increasing frequency. The particular rustle of someone changing bed linens, already soaked through with perspiration. Your serving girl returns, but this time, her voice comes from much farther down the corridor, as if she no longer trusts herself to approach your door. "My lord," she calls, her words floating through the darkness like smoke. The kitchen master begs to know, "Shall we prepare the morning meal?" The question hangs in the air, laden with meaning that goes far beyond bread and ale. How many will be alive to break their fast? How many hands will be steady enough to hold a cup? In the arithmetic of plague, every normal activity becomes a wager against an uncertain future. You try to call back an answer, but your voice emerges as barely more than a whisper. The effort leaves you dizzy, as if speaking has cost you something precious that you cannot afford to lose. Instead, you listen as she asks the same question at other doors, receiving mostly silence in reply. The palace fills with the absence of voices that should be there. Through your chamber wall comes a sound that makes your blood slow in your veins, the unmistakable rhythm of someone being sick, violently and repeatedly. It's a visceral reminder that the sweating sickness rarely travels alone. Fever brings nausea, weakness breeds delirium, and what begins as simple perspiration can cascade into complete physical collapse within the span of a few heartbeats. The candle flame beside your bed gutters and nearly dies, sending shadows careening across the room like living things trying to escape their own darkness. In that moment of near extinction, you glimpse something that shouldn't be there, a figure standing in the corner where no figure was before. But when the flame steadies, showing nothing but familiar tapestries and the wooden chest that holds your few valuable possessions, you understand that the fever has begun to play tricks on your eyes. This is how it happens, according to the accounts that survive from previous outbreaks. The sweat brings visions, hallucinations that feel more real than the stone walls around you. Some victims spend their final hours conversing with long-dead relatives, while others flee their beds to escape imaginary pursuers that only they can see. The line between waking and dreaming dissolves like salt in water. Your night shift clings to your skin now, thoroughly soaked, despite the fact that you've done nothing more strenuous than lie still and listen to your own heart race. The fabric feels cold against your heated flesh, creating an odd contrast that seems to summarize everything strange about this plague. Hot and cold simultaneously, urgent yet patient, democratic yet mysteriously selective in its victims. Somewhere in the palace, a bell begins to toll, not the great clock's bronze voice, but something smaller and more intimate, perhaps a chapel bell, calling the faithful to prayers that may be their last. The sound carries a weight that has nothing to do with the metal that creates it, each note heavy with the accumulated fear of everyone who hears it, and wonders if they'll live to hear it ring again. 7 hours until dawn. The number feels both infinitely long and terrifyingly short, like trying to count the space between lightning and thunder while standing in the storm itself. You close your eyes and feel the fever building behind your eyelids. Not painful yet, but present in the way that distant thunder announces the approach of rain you cannot yet see, but know is coming. Each breath becomes a small negotiation with the air around you, as if the very atmosphere has thickened with the collective exhalations of everyone fighting the same battle. The palace breathes like a single, enormous lung struggling to expand, and you are part of that struggle now. Your fate tied to the fate of everyone else who sweats and shivers in the darkness, waiting for dawn to decide who gets to see another day. The palace clock chimes 6 times, each bronze note seeming to hang in the air longer than nature intended, as if time itself has grown thick and reluctant. 5 hours remain until dawn, and the mathematical certainty of your situation settles over you like a heavy quilt, comforting and suffocating in equal measure. Through the walls comes a sound that will haunt your dreams if you live to have them again. The soft thud of a body meeting stone, followed by the unmistakable rustle of silk against the floor. Someone has collapsed in the corridor beyond your chamber, their court finery now serving as an elaborate shroud against the cold stones of Whitehall. You hear voices then, urgent whispers that carry the particular cadence of people trying to solve an impossible problem with inadequate tools. Lift her gently. No, mind her head. God's blood. She's burning like a forge. The words fade as they carry their burden away, leaving only the lingering scent of rose water and something else. Something that smells like fear given physical form. The royal physician arrives with a procession that sounds like a small army. The clatter of metal instruments in leather bags, the shuffle of apprentices' feet, the whispered consultations that grow more frantic with each passing moment. Through your keyhole comes the flicker of torchlight as they examine the fallen courtier in the hallway, their Latin murmurs rising and falling like an ineffective prayer. Sanguis nimis calidus, you hear the physician declare, his voice carrying the hollow confidence of a man who knows his words mean nothing but cannot afford to admit it. The blood is too hot, he says, as if this plague were nothing more than an imbalance of humors that could be corrected with leeches and bitter herbs. You almost laugh, but the effort would cost you breath. You cannot spare. Your own fever has reached that strange plateau where everything becomes unnaturally clear and distant simultaneously. The tapestry on your wall depicts King Arthur drawing Excalibur from the stone, but now the threads seem to writhe and shift, telling different stories with each flicker of candlelight. Sometimes Arthur succeeds in his quest, sometimes he fails, leaving the sword embedded forever in rock that will not yield. The dampness has spread to your chest now, creating a peculiar sensation as if your body were weeping from the inside out. Each breath carries moisture that shouldn't be there, and you find yourself counting them, not from anxiety, but from the strange fascination that comes when ordinary functions become extraordinary, simply by virtue of their uncertainty. Breath in, pause, breath out, repeat until dawn, or until the pattern breaks forever. Through your window, you glimpse more figures moving in the courtyard below, but their movements have changed. No longer the urgent hurrying of earlier hours, but something slower and more deliberate. The careful steps of people who understand that sudden movement might trigger consequences they cannot predict. They walk like dancers in a performance where missing a step means death, each gesture measured against the possibility that it might be their last. The physician's voice rises in frustration as his remedies prove useless against the mysterious plague. You hear him instructing his apprentices to prepare poultices of wormwood and treacle, to recite prayers over vials of blessed water that will accomplish nothing except perhaps offering comfort to those who need to believe in something larger than their own mortality. But there's wisdom in his desperation, even if he doesn't recognize it himself. The sweating sickness respects no authority. Not medical knowledge, not royal bloodlines, not the accumulated learning of centuries. It reduces everyone to the same fundamental equation: survive the night or surrender to whatever waits beyond the morning light. Your serving girl appears at your door again, but this time she makes no attempt to speak. Instead, you hear only the soft sound of something being placed against the wooden threshold. Perhaps bread, perhaps water, perhaps nothing more than the gesture of human kindness that persists, even when hope has abandoned the premises. The fact that she's still alive to make the gesture feels like a small miracle in itself. The candle burns lower, its flame dancing in patterns that seem almost purposeful, as if it too were trying to tell you something about the nature of time and light, and the space between heartbeats, where life makes its most important decisions. Soon you'll need to light another wick, but the simple act of rising from bed feels as complex as ascending a mountain peak while carrying the weight of the entire Tudor court on your shoulders. 5 hours until dawn. The number carries a different meaning now. Not just a countdown towards safety, but a recognition that you've already survived longer than many who began this night with stronger constitutions and better physicians. Each moment becomes a small victory. Each breath a testament to your body's stubborn refusal to surrender without a fight. In the distance, another bell begins to toll, joining the chapel bell in a mournful harmony that speaks of losses already counted and losses yet to come. The sound creates a strange comfort, reminding you that you are not alone in this struggle, that somewhere in the darkness, others are fighting the same battle, measuring their lives in the same precious increments of time that stretch toward an uncertain dawn. The great clock strikes 8, its bronze voice carrying across a palace that has learned the particular silence of those who listen, for sounds they hope never to hear. 2 hours until dawn, and something fundamental shifts in the rhythm of your fever, not breaking, but changing tempo, like a musical piece moving from allegro to something altogether more mysterious. The strange calm settles over you like morning mist over a still pond. Your breathing, which has been shallow and rapid for hours, suddenly finds a deeper rhythm. The perspiration that has soaked your night shift continues, but loses its frantic urgency. Even the hallucinations that have danced at the edges of your vision seem to pause, as if they too sense that something important is about to happen. This is the moment Tudor physicians feared most, not the dramatic collapse or the violent fever, but this peculiar stillness that arrives like the eye of a hurricane. In their crude understanding of the sweating sickness, they recognize this calm as either the harbinger of recovery or the prelude to something far more final. The body's last negotiation with mortality, played out in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Through the palace walls, you sense the same eerie quiet spreading room by room, corridor by corridor. The urgent whispers have faded. The running footsteps have stilled. Even the physician's Latin murmurs have given way to something approaching reverence, as if he finally understands that he stands witness to a mystery that cannot be solved with leeches and philosophy. Your chamber feels different now, larger somehow, as if the fever has expanded your perception beyond the normal boundaries of stone and timber. The tapestry on the wall no longer shifts and writhes, but instead seems to glow with its own internal light. King Arthur stands frozen at the moment of drawing Excalibur, neither success nor failure, but something suspended between possibilities, like your own fate, hangs suspended between the chiming of clocks. The candle beside your bed burns with unusual steadiness, its flame tall and unwavering, despite the fact that no wind should be able to reach it here. The light casts no dancing shadows now, but instead illuminates your chamber with the kind of clarity that comes only in dreams, or in those moments when the ordinary world reveals its hidden architecture. You realize you can hear your own heartbeat, not as the frantic racing of earlier hours, but as something slower and more deliberate, the steady percussion that has counted every moment of your life, and now counts toward whatever comes next. Each beat carries weight, like the footsteps of someone walking toward a destination they cannot yet see, but somehow recognize. Beyond your window, the courtyard is emptied completely. No more figures moving between shadows. No more urgent conferences in the darkness. Even the peacocks that normally cry from their roosts have fallen silent, as if all of Whitehall Palace holds its breath in this moment before dawn decides who will witness its arrival and who will remain forever in the darkness that preceded it. The serving girl makes one final approach to your door, but this time her presence feels different, not the worried concern of earlier hours, but something approaching the ceremony. She doesn't speak, doesn't knock, doesn't leave anything at your threshold. Instead, you simply sense her there, keeping vigil in the way that people keep vigil at bedsides, when words have become inadequate, and only presence matters. Your fever reaches its strange equilibrium, hot and cold simultaneously, urgent and peaceful, frightening and oddly comforting. You understand now why some victims of the sweating sickness were found in their beds, looking as if they had simply chosen to sleep deeper than usual. There's a temptation in this calm, a seductive whisper that suggests rest might be easier than the struggle to see another sunrise. But alongside that temptation comes something else, a stubborn ember of curiosity about what dawn will bring, what stories will be told about this night, what lessons will be learned or forgotten by those who survive to remember. The fever may have taken your strength, but it hasn't taken your essential self, the part of you that wants to know how the story ends. The great clock prepares to chime again, its mechanism moving with the same inexorable precision that governs the movement of stars and the beating of hearts and the strange mathematics of plague that decides who lives and who does not. In the space between one bronze note and the next, you rest in the calm that comes before all great transformations, whether they lead toward dawn or toward the deeper darkness that waits beyond all dawns. 2 hours until sunrise. The number no longer feels like a countdown or promise, but simply like information. A fact as neutral as the color of your chamber walls or the weight of your blanket. Time has become something to inhabit, rather than something to survive. And in that inhabitation, you find a peace that has nothing to do with the fever that continues to course through your veins, like liquid starlight. Names blur on a parchment roll as candles weep, hot wax. You drift now between the stone walls and somewhere else entirely, where Tudor ghosts move through corridors that exist only in the space between sleeping and waking. The fever carries you backwards through the night, or perhaps forwards into dreams that haven't happened yet. The serving girl walks past your door again, but this time, her feet make no sound, and when you try to call out, your voice dissolves like sugar in rain. She carries something in her hands, a bowl perhaps, or maybe just the cupped darkness that pools in her palms. You cannot tell if she's bringing medicine or prayers, or simply the weight of her own fear wrapped in linen. The candle flame stretches impossibly tall, reaching toward a ceiling that seems miles away. Each drop of wax that falls creates its own tiny universe, complete with miniature palaces, where miniature courtiers sweat through miniature fevers. The sound each drop makes, when it hits the pewter, like distant bells tolling for people you've never met, but somehow remember, through walls made of mist and memory. You hear the physician's voice, but the Latin words transform into something older, something that might have been spoken in stone circles when the world was younger. His remedies become incantations. His leather bag transforms into something that might hold moonlight or the last breath of dying stars. The courtyard below your window fills with figures that cast no shadows. They move in patterns that spell out messages you almost understand. Their faces shine with moisture that catches light from sources you cannot see. Some of them might be people you know, or perhaps they're reflections of people you might have been. If the fever had taken different paths through your blood, your heartbeat becomes the palace's heartbeat, and the palace's heartbeat becomes the rhythm of waves against distant shores, where ships arrive carrying passengers who disembark into dreams. The bronze voice of the great clock no longer marks time, but instead counts the spaces between thoughts, the pauses between breaths, the silence that lives inside every word that will never be spoken. The tapestry on your wall tells different stories now. King Arthur draws his sword not from stone, but from the heart of a sleeping dragon, whose breath creates morning mist, whose dreams become the fever that moves through your veins. The threads weave themselves into new patterns, showing you castles built from crystallized sweat, where the architecture changes with each occupant's pulse. Somewhere a woman sings, her voice floating through walls that have forgotten how to be solid. The melody carries fragments of lullabies, mixed with prayers you learned as a child, when the world felt safer, and fevers were things that ended with sunrise and cool clothes, pressed against foreheads by people who loved you enough to stay awake through the darkness. The dampness on your skin transforms into something else. Not sweat, but dew. The kind that forms on spider webs at dawn, when the world holds its breath between night and day. Each drop contains tiny reflections of everything that has ever been, and everything that might still become, if you can navigate the space between one heartbeat and the next. Your chamber door stands open, though you never heard it move. Beyond the threshold lies not a corridor, but a vast library, where every book contains the same story, told in different languages, with different endings. Some conclude with sunrise, others with starlight, all of them written in ink that smells like rosewater and fear, and the particular sweetness that comes when breathing becomes conscious choice rather than involuntary action. The fever speaks to you in a voice made of warm honey and distant thunder, telling you secrets about the mathematics of mortality, about how time moves differently when filtered through flesh that has learned to weep without tears, about the democracy of plague that reduces kings and servants to the same basic equation: survive or surrender, live or become memory. 2 hours until dawn, or perhaps 2 centuries, or perhaps 2 heartbeats. Time has become elastic, stretching to accommodate all the dreams that need dreaming, all the fears that need acknowledging, all the small miracles that occur when ordinary people discover they are stronger than they ever imagined, in ways they never expected to need. The candle flame dances one final time, casting shadows that might be angels, or might be the shapes that darkness makes, when it tries to comfort those who must walk through valleys, where even whispers echo like thunder, and every breath carries the weight of all the stories that end, with someone choosing to keep breathing until dawn decides who gets to see another day. The fever dreams fade like morning mist, and suddenly you find yourself 43 years in the past, standing in a field that reeks of churned earth and something darker, the metallic scent that clings to battlefields where too much blood has been spilled too quickly. This is Bosworth Field, August 22nd, 1485, and the Tudor banner snaps overhead in a wind that carries more than the promise of rain. Henry Tudor's mercenaries huddle in their canvas shelters, their faces drawn with exhaustion that goes deeper than the weariness of march and battle. These are fighting men who have crossed the Channel from France, carrying with them not just weapons and ambition, but something invisible and infinitely more dangerous: the seeds of England's strangest plague, germinating in the close quarters of ships and spreading through the intimate democracy of shared breath and sweat. You watch as a soldier near the largest tent suddenly staggers, pressing his hand to his forehead, where moisture beads. Despite the cool August morning, his companions barely glance up from sharpening their weapons, accustomed to seeing men succumb to battle nerves, or the flux that travels with armies. They cannot know they are witnessing the birth of something that will haunt English courts for the next 66 years. The tent canvas steams in the dawn air, heavy with the exhalations of men who sleep fitfully when they sleep at all. Inside, you glimpse figures moving with the jerky urgency of fever, not the clean fever of infection that physicians understand, but something stranger, something that seems to rise from the very earth beneath their feet and settle into their bones, like an unwelcome guest who plans to stay. A Welsh archer stumbles from his shelter, his tunic already darkening with perspiration that shouldn't exist in the cool air before sunrise. He calls for water in a voice that cracks with thirst. No liquid can satisfy, and when his tent mates bring him ale, he waves it away with hands that shake, for reasons that have nothing to do with fear of the coming battle. The sweating sickness has found its first English victim, though no one yet knows the name for what they are witnessing. Through the camp, you see the pattern beginning to establish itself. Soldiers rising from their bedrolls, already damp with perspiration, stumbling to tent flaps to seek air that offers no relief, calling for physicians who have no remedies for ailments they cannot identify. The Tudor banner flaps overhead like a signal flag announcing the arrival of something unprecedented in English experience. By midday, when Richard III's forces finally appear on the opposite ridge, Henry Tudor's army carries more than political ambition into battle. They carry the microscopic harbingers of a plague that will redefine the very nature of royal vulnerability, that will empty palaces and monasteries with equal efficiency, that will teach English physicians the limits of their knowledge in the most humbling terms possible. The battle itself unfolds with the brutal efficiency that defines all such encounters: steel against steel, horse against foot, crown against crown. But in the spaces between sword strokes, you notice soldiers pausing to wipe moisture from their brows, stumbling not from wounds, but from weakness that seems to rise from within. Some collapse during the fighting, their armor clattering against the ground as they succumb to an enemy that wears no colors and serves no king. When the dust settles, and Richard lies dead in the marshy ground beside Bosworth Brook, Henry Tudor surveys a field littered with more than the usual casualties of civil war. His victory has cost him not just the blood price that all crowns demand, but the first payment on a debt he doesn't yet understand: the introduction of sweating sickness to English soil, carried in the lungs and blood of foreign mercenaries who thought they were bringing only swords to settle a dynastic dispute. The new king's physician, a learned man who studied at Padua and considers himself versed in all the ailments that flesh is heir to, examines the fallen soldiers with growing confusion. These men show none of the familiar signs of battle fever, none of the clean wounds that can be sutured and blessed. Instead, they lie in pools of their own perspiration, their faces bearing expressions of surprise rather than pain, as if death had arrived wearing an unfamiliar mask. That night, as Henry Tudor's army makes camp on ground still warm with recent bloodshed, the tents begin to steam again. The sweating sickness spreads through the victorious forces like wildfire through dry grass, claiming soldiers who survived French wars and English battles, but cannot survive this invisible enemy that attacks from within. By morning, the new king understands that his crown comes with a curse embedded in its very metal, a plague that will shadow his dynasty and redefine what it means to rule a kingdom where death can arrive as swiftly as a summer storm. You feel yourself being pulled back toward your own time, toward your own chamber where the fever continues its patient work. But the vision of Bosworth Field clings to your consciousness like smoke. Now you understand the deeper arithmetic of your situation. You are not just fighting for your own survival, but participating in a mystery that began with foreign mercenaries and a usurper's crown, a plague that has woven itself into the very fabric of Tudor England like a thread of darkness in a tapestry of gold. The fever carries you forward, through time like a river carrying driftwood. And suddenly, you stand in the shadowed cloisters of Oxford, where ancient stones hold the echoes of centuries of learning, and the more recent memory of academic debates, cut short by perspiration that no amount of scholarly wisdom can explain. The year is 1517, 32 years after Bosworth, and the sweating sickness has returned to claim a harvest among England's finest minds. In the colleges where Thomas More once walked, and where Erasmus penned his letters, young scholars bend over their books, only to find their vision blurring as moisture beads on foreheads that should be cool in the stone-walled chambers designed to preserve both manuscripts and the men who study them. You watch a group of theology students debating the finer points of Latin declension in the courtyard of Christ Church, their voices rising and falling in the familiar rhythm of academic argument. But as the morning progresses, their debate grows sluggish, their words interrupted by the need to wipe dampness from their brows, their gestures becoming increasingly languid, as if the very air has thickened around them, like honey mixed with dread. The college bells chime the hour, but their bronze voices seem muffled, as if the sound itself struggles to move through atmosphere heavy with the collective exhalations of men whose bodies have begun the mysterious process of weeping without tears. In the scriptoriums, where monks copy manuscripts with careful precision. You see ink-stained fingers trembling, not from the chill of morning, but from the fever that creeps through academic cloisters, with the same patient efficiency it showed on battlefields and in royal courts. A young scholar from Magdalen College stumbles into the courtyard, his black gown already darkening with perspiration, despite the October cold that should make breath visible, and skin grateful for wool coverings. He calls out to his friends in a voice that carries the particular hoarseness that comes when fever dries the throat, while simultaneously flooding the skin with moisture that serves no cooling purpose. The sweating sickness, he gasps, and the words scatter his companions, like pigeons, startled by a hawk's shadow. They know the name now, though they understand nothing of its nature or origin. 32 years of intermittent outbreaks have taught English physicians to recognize the symptoms without bringing them any closer to comprehending the disease itself. In the college infirmary, you witness the futile application of Renaissance medicine to a plague that respects neither learning nor logic. The physician, a man who studied at Bologna and considers himself versed in the works of Galen and Avicenna, prescribes bloodletting for patients who are already losing vital fluids through their skin, recommends warming herbs for fevers that seem to burn from within, while leaving the flesh oddly cool to touch. The college libraries, normally filled with the whispered conversations of scholars pursuing knowledge, fall silent as students abandon their books to flee, or to tend to friends who collapse between one paragraph and the next. Ancient texts lie open on reading tables, their pages fluttering in drafts that carry the scent of perspiration and the particular mustiness that accompanies learning, interrupted by mortality. You see a philosophy student attempting to continue his reading of Aristotle, even as sweat drips onto the parchment, creating small dark circles that blur the Greek letters into abstract patterns. His determination speaks to something admirable in human nature, the refusal to let death interrupt the pursuit of knowledge, but also to the tragic irony that all his learning cannot protect him from a disease that medieval physicians would understand no better than ancient Greeks. The college chapel fills with voices raised not in academic disputation, but in desperate prayer, as scholars who spend their days parsing the logic of Thomas Aquinas discover that fever reduces all philosophical complexity to a single urgent question: will I live to see another dawn? The sweating sickness democratizes death in a way that troubles men accustomed to believing that education offers some protection against the world's cruder realities. As evening falls over Oxford's spires, you watch the college courtyards empty, as those who can still walk flee toward villages that may or may not offer safety, while those too weak to travel barricade themselves in chambers that become either healing sanctuaries or elaborate tombs. The great bells continue to chime the hours, but each bronze note now carries the weight of time running out rather than time simply passing. The fever dream vision begins to fade as you feel yourself being drawn back toward your own chamber, your own night, your own negotiation with the sweating sickness that has claimed scholars and soldiers, courtiers and kings. But the image of Oxford's stones, darkened with the perspiration of England's brightest minds, clings to your consciousness like a warning about the limits of human knowledge when confronted with mysteries that predate universities and will outlast the men who built them. You understand now that your struggle is part of a larger story, not just the tale of one courtier's fever, but the chronicle of a plague that has touched every corner of English society, sparing neither the learned nor the ignorant, neither the powerful nor the powerless. The sweating sickness chooses its victims with an arithmetic that no Renaissance mathematician can calculate, following laws that no scholar can decode, pursuing a logic that remains opaque, even to those who dedicate their lives to understanding the hidden mechanisms that govern flesh and blood, and the mysterious space where body meets spirit in the democracy of mortal fear. The fever carries you across the North Sea, on salt winds that taste of herring and dread, depositing you in the bustling port of Hamburg, where English merchant ships rock at anchor like fevered dreams made manifest in wood and canvas. The year is your own, 1528. But here the sweating sickness wears a different face, speaking in Germanic tongues, while maintaining its essential character of swift, inexplicable death. You stand on dock timbers, slick with morning mist, and something else, the particular dampness that clings to places where the plague has made its presence known. English merchants, who sailed from London's wharves, carrying wool and tin, now unload their cargo with hands that shake from more than the autumn chill that rises from the Elbe River, like the breath of sleeping giants. The Hanseatic League's great trading houses, those monuments to commercial ambition that stretch along Hamburg's waterfront like stone declarations of prosperity, now echo with sounds that have nothing to do with the usual business of buying and selling. Through windows designed to display the wealth of merchant princes, you glimpse figures moving with the telltale urgency of those who feel their skin beginning to weep without cause. A wool merchant from York stumbles from his ship's gangplank, his leather jerkin already darkening with perspiration, despite the October cold that should make breath visible and skin grateful for warmth. He calls out to German dock workers in broken phrases that mix English commerce with universal human panic. Hilf, help, the sweat, der Schweiß. His words carry across the harbor like seeds on wind, planting fear in minds that had never conceived of plague arriving disguised as trade goods. The German physicians, learned men who studied at Heidelberg and Prague, examined the English merchants with the same baffled concentration their Oxford counterparts displayed. They prescribed the same useless remedies, bloodletting for patients already losing vital fluids, warming herbs for fevers that burn without heating, prayers in Latin that accomplish nothing except perhaps offering comfort to those who need to believe in something larger than their own mortality. You watch as the contagion spreads through Hamburg's merchant quarter with the methodical efficiency of spilled wine soaking through fine cloth. German traders, who shared ale with English captains, now find themselves sharing something far more intimate, the democracy of perspiration that reduces all commercial calculations to a single urgent arithmetic. Survive the next few hours, or surrender to whatever waits beyond the morning tide. The great trading houses that normally bustle with the complex negotiations of international commerce fall silent as merchants abandon their ledgers to flee or to tend to colleagues who collapse between one transaction and the next. Account books lie open on counting tables, their pages fluttering in drafts that carry the scent of nutmeg and cloves, mixed with the particular mustiness that accompanies prosperity interrupted by mortality. In the harbor, ships from England continue to arrive, their holds full of English wool and English plague, their crews already showing the telltale signs of moisture beading on foreheads that should be dry in the autumn air. The captains, weathered men who have navigated storms and pirates with equal skill, find themselves helpless against an enemy that attacks from within, that spreads through the intimate democracy of shared quarters and shared breath. The Hamburg City Council meets in an emergency session, their deliberations conducted in urgent whispers, as if speaking too loudly might attract the attention of whatever invisible force has transformed their prosperous port into a way station for death. They debate quarantine measures that come too late, trade restrictions that cannot contain what has already spread through their warehouses and counting houses like smoke through a ship's hull. A young German clerk, barely past his apprenticeship in the mysteries of double-entry bookkeeping, attempts to maintain his master's accounts even as sweat drips onto the parchment, creating small dark circles that blur the careful columns of debits and credits into abstract patterns. His determination speaks to something admirable in human nature, the refusal to let death interrupt the pursuit of order, but also to the tragic irony that all his mathematical precision cannot calculate the odds of his own survival. The Lutheran churches fill with voices raised in German hymns that carry the same desperate urgency as prayers chanted in Oxford colleges or whispered in English courts. The Reformation may have changed the language of worship, but fever reduces all theological complexity to the same fundamental question: will divine providence extend to those who sweat without cause in the darkness before dawn? As the northern lights flicker over Hamburg's spires, you watch the harbor empty as ships that can still sail flee toward ports that may or may not offer safety, while vessels too plague-ridden to navigate become floating monuments to the sweating sickness's indifference to national boundaries. The great trading bells continue to chime the hours, but each bronze note now carries the weight of commerce interrupted rather than commerce conducted. The fever dream vision begins to fade as you feel yourself being drawn back across the North Sea, back toward your own chamber, where the English version of the plague continues its patient work. But the image of Hamburg's docks, slick with the perspiration of international trade, made mortal, clings to your consciousness like salt spray that stings long after the voyage ends. You understand now that your fever connects you not just to other English sufferers, but to a network of perspiration that spans the continent, linking merchant to merchant, port to port, in a commerce of mortality that respects no customs barriers or trade agreements. The sweating sickness has revealed the hidden arteries of European connection, turning trade routes into plague paths and transforming the prosperity of nations into a shared vulnerability that recognizes no flags or languages, only the universal democracy of flesh that learns to weep without tears in the darkness before dawn. The fever dream carries you forward, through time, like leaves swept by autumn wind, and suddenly you stand in the heart of rural England, where church bells toll across meadows that have never known the complexities of court politics or international trade, yet now echo with the same bronze notes of mortality that have haunted palaces and ports for 66 years. This is 1551, the final chapter in England's long dialogue with the sweating sickness. Though the farmers who rise before dawn to tend their cattle, and the village wives who bake bread in ovens, still warm from yesterday's heat, cannot know they are witnessing the end of an era. In Gloucestershire and Worcestershire, in the small market towns that dot the countryside like settlements on some vast green sea, the plague makes its final bow on English soil, with the same theatrical flair that marked its debut on Bosworth Field. You watch a village blacksmith emerge from his forge at midday, his leather apron already darkened with honest sweat from the morning's work, only to pause as a different kind of moisture begins to bead on his forehead, the telltale dampness that speaks of fever rather than labor, of illness rather than industry. He sets down his hammer with hands that have shaped horseshoes and plowshares for 20 years, but now shakes with a tremor that has nothing to do with the weight of metal against anvil. The village church bells begin their noon call to prayer, but today the bronze notes carry an urgency that transcends the usual summons to worship. In cottages scattered across the surrounding hills, families who breakfasted together in the gray light before sunrise now gather around beds where fathers, mothers, children lie glistening with perspiration that serves no cooling purpose, their faces bearing expressions of surprise rather than pain, as if death had arrived, wearing an unfamiliar costume. Country physicians, men whose medical knowledge consists mainly of herb lore, passed down through generations of rural practice, find themselves as helpless as their learned colleagues in London and Oxford. They prescribe willow bark tea and feverfew poultices. They burn aromatic herbs to purify the air. They recite prayers learned from village priests who studied in monasteries that Henry VIII dissolved 2 decades earlier. Nothing works. The sweating sickness respects neither folk wisdom nor formal education, neither ancient tradition nor recent innovation. In the market square of a Cotswold town whose name history will be forgotten, you witness the particular democracy that marks the plague's final performance. A wool merchant who trades with London collapses beside his cart of fleeces, while a shepherd's boy who has never traveled beyond the next valley succumbs in exactly the same manner, both reduced to the same fundamental equation of moisture and time, both participants in a mystery that began with foreign mercenaries and now concludes with English earth, absorbing the perspiration of those who will be its last victims. The village ale houses, normally filled with the comfortable conversations of men who have known each other since childhood, fall silent as patrons abandon their pewter mugs to tend to neighbors who stagger through doors, already darkened with sweat, despite the spring coolness that should make coarse woolens comfortable and faces grateful for hearth fires. The familiar rhythms of rural life, morning milking, midday meals, evening prayers, dissolve into something more primitive, the simple, desperate desire to survive until sunset, then until sunrise, then until the next sunset in an endless negotiation with time itself. A village priest, a young man recently ordained, who considers his calling a sacred trust, attempts to offer last rites to parishioners who may not be dying at all, but cannot be certain they are living. His Latin prayers mix with English pleas, his formal training with genuine bewilderment, as he confronts a plague that seems to mock the very notion that death should follow predictable patterns or announce its arrival with familiar symptoms. The English countryside, which has endured Danish invasions and Norman conquests, civil wars and religious reformations, now faces its strangest test, a plague that kills without explanation, that strikes without warning, that chooses its victims according to mathematics no rural philosopher can decode. Village-wise women who have delivered babies and tended fevers for generations find themselves as baffled as university-trained physicians, their traditional remedies proving as useless as academic theories against an enemy that follows no rules they recognize. As evening falls over church spires that have marked time for centuries, you watch the countryside empty as those who can still walk flee toward towns that may or may not offer safety, while those too weak to travel transform their cottages into either healing sanctuaries or elaborate tombs. The church bells continue to chime the hours, but each bronze note now carries the weight of ending rather than continuation, of conclusion rather than persistence. But this time, something different happens. Instead of spreading further, instead of claiming more victims, the sweating sickness simply stops. Like a fever breaking, like a storm passing, like a tide reaching its highest point and then receding. The plague that has haunted England for 66 years makes its final bow and exits the stage of English history as mysteriously as it entered, leaving behind only questions and empty spaces where people once stood. The fever dream vision begins to fade as you feel yourself being drawn back toward your own time, your own chamber, your own night in 1528, when the plague still had 23 years left to run. But the image of English fields, dampened with the final perspiration of the sweating sickness's last victims, clings to your consciousness like morning dew that evaporates slowly, reluctantly, leaving only the memory of moisture and the promise that some mysteries resolve themselves, not through understanding, but through simple cessation. You understand now that your struggle occurs near the middle of the plague's long arc across English history, that you are fighting not just for your own survival but participating in a phenomenon that will touch thousands more lives before it finally exhausts itself in country churchyards and village squares, spending its force against the patient endurance of rural England before vanishing as completely as morning mist burned away by summer sun. Linen sheets ripple like tidal flats under moonlit infirmary windows. You drift again between the village bells and somewhere softer, where time moves like honey, poured from silver spoons, and the fever carries you backwards, or perhaps sideways, through rooms that exist only when breathing becomes conscious, when heartbeats echo like footsteps in empty cathedrals. The serving girl returns, but now she wears the faces of all the women who have ever tended fever, village wives with herb-stained fingers, court ladies with silk-scented breath, German merchant daughters, counting foreign coins, their hands all move with the same careful gentleness, placing cool clothes that warm instantly, offering water that tastes like dissolved stars. Moonlight spills through windows that sometimes face east, sometimes west, sometimes directions that have no names. The silver light pools on stone floors that might be palace chambers, or cottage rooms, or ship cabins rocking on midnight seas. Each drop of brightness creates its own small universe, where fever dreams go to rest between one breath and the next. The physician's voice echoes from centuries you have not yet lived, speaking in languages that blend Latin with longing, prescribing remedies made from crystallized hope and powdered time. His leather bag transforms into something that might hold moonbeams, or the final sighs of those who chose to stop sweating and discovered what lies beyond the democracy of moisture. Through walls made of silver mist and memory, You hear all the bells that have ever been tolled for sweating sickness. Bronze voices from Bosworth Field, Oxford Towers, Hamburg harbors, English villages where church spires point towards stars that remember when the world was younger and plagues had names that people could pronounce. Without their voices trembling, the tapestry tells its story again. But now, King Arthur draws his sword from his own fever, and the blade gleams with droplets that might be sweat, or might be the tears that time sheds, when it watches mortality play out, in chambers where candles burn lower, and shadows grow longer, and breathing becomes a conversation between flesh and spirit. Your heartbeat becomes the rhythm of waves against shores that exist only in the space between sleeping and waking. Each pulse carries messages written in a script that dissolves before you can read the words, but leaves behind the feeling that someone, somewhere, is counting your breaths and finding them precious. The courtyard below fills with figures that cast shadows made of silver. They move in patterns that spell out the names of everyone who has ever fought this fever and won or lost, or discovered that winning and losing are just different words for the same courageous act of continuing to breathe when breathing requires more strength than it seems possible. Somewhere a lullaby drifts through air that tastes of rosewater and the particular sweetness that comes when time slows to accommodate all the small miracles that occur when ordinary people discover they are connected to everyone else who has ever watched candle flames dance and wondered which breath might be their last. The dampness on your skin transforms into something else, not sweat, but starlight made liquid. Each drop contains tiny reflections of every dawn that has ever broken over chambers where someone chose to keep breathing until light returned to chase away the particular darkness that only fever can create. Your chamber door stands neither open nor closed, but exists in that space between possibilities, where healing and harm dance together like partners who have known each other since time began. Each breath you take votes for tomorrow. Each heartbeat casts a ballot in an election where the only candidates are continuation and rest. The fever speaks in whispers made of warm honey and distant thunder, telling you secrets about the mathematics of moisture, about how time moves differently when filtered through flesh that has learned to weep without tears, about the democracy of perspiration that connects palace to cottage, court to field, heart to heart. 2 hours, or perhaps 2 heartbeats, or perhaps 2 centuries. Time has become elastic, stretching to accommodate all the dreams that need dreaming, all the prayers that need whispering, all the small acts of courage that occur when breathing becomes a choice rather than an inevitability. The candle flame dances patterns that might spell your name, or might be the shadow language that darkness uses when it wants to comfort those who walk through valleys where even whispers echo like thunder, and every breath carries the weight of all the stories that end with someone choosing to see what dawn might bring. The fever dream shifts like candlelight against parchment, and suddenly you find yourself observing your own body with the detached curiosity of a Renaissance physician, mapping the strange geography of symptoms that have puzzled learned men for decades. Your flesh becomes a living manuscript, where the sweating sickness writes its cryptic message in a language that no medical school has taught any mortal soul to read. Hour 1 arrives like a whisper, that first bead of moisture on your temple, innocent as morning dew, yet carrying the weight of mortal consequence. Your skin grows clammy, despite the July warmth, and there's a metallic taste creeping across your tongue, like the memory of copper coins held too long in a fevered palm. The perspiration feels different from honest sweat, cooler somehow, as if your body were weeping tears it cannot shed through ordinary channels. By the second hour, your pulse quickens to a rhythm that matches no earthly music, racing like a courser's hooves against cobblestones, while your breathing grows shallow and urgent. The dampness spreads from your temples to your throat, pooling in the hollow where life beats its steady drum against the approaching storm. Your night shift clings to skin that alternates between burning and freezing, creating sensations that medieval physicians described as the fever of contradictions. The third hour brings the hallucinations, shadows that move without light to cast them, figures standing in corners where no figures should exist, voices calling your name in languages you have never learned yet somehow understand. The boundary between waking and dreaming dissolves like salt in water, leaving you adrift in a realm where past and present mingle like wine mixed with honey, sweet and intoxicating, and potentially fatal. Hour 4 introduces the peculiar weakness that Tudor physicians found so baffling. Not the gradual enfeeblement of ordinary illness, but a sudden sapping of strength that leaves victims unable to rise from their beds, despite feeling alert and conscious. Your limbs grow heavy, as if filled with lead, yet your mind remains sharp enough to observe its own dissolution, with the clarity that comes only when mortality strips away all pretense and leaves truth naked in candlelight. By the 5th hour, if you have survived this long, the fever reaches its terrible equilibrium, that strange calm that physicians feared more than violent symptoms. Your body temperature stabilizes at a point that should be fatal yet somehow is not. Your perspiration continues without relieving the heat that burns beneath your skin, and time itself seems to pause like an actor, waiting for his cue on a stage where the playwright has forgotten to write the final scene. This is the hour when the sweating sickness reveals its true nature, not a disease in any conventional sense, but something more mysterious, a phenomenon that exists at the intersection of flesh and spirit, of mortal vulnerability, and whatever invisible forces govern the arithmetic of who lives and who does not. The plague follows no rules that Renaissance medicine recognizes, respects no theories that learned men have constructed to explain the mechanisms of illness and recovery. Hour 6 brings either resolution or surrender, though the distinction between the two becomes meaningless when viewed from the fevered perspective of someone whose body has become a battlefield where invisible armies clash, without banners or battle cries. Some victims emerge from this hour with their fever broken, their skin dry, their strength slowly returning, like a tide flowing back across mud flats. Others simply stop, their breathing growing shallower until it ceases entirely, their faces bearing expressions of surprise rather than suffering. The final hour, should you reach it, unfolds like a slow dawn breaking over disputed territory. Either your body's ancient wisdom finds some way to negotiate a truce with the mysterious invader, or the sweating sickness completes its work with the methodical efficiency that has made it the most feared plague in Tudor England. There is no middle ground, no gradual decline, no lingering invalidism. The mathematics are stark: survive or surrender, live or become memory, continue breathing, or join the countless others whose perspiration has dampened English soil from battlefield to palace to cottage floor. You map these symptoms on the parchment of your own experience, feeling each hour unfold with the precision of a clock mechanism, designed by some celestial clockmaker who measures time not in minutes, but in heartbeats, not in moments, but in the spaces between breaths where life makes its most important decisions. The fever has transformed you into both patient and physician, observer and observed, mapping the territory of your own mortality with the careful attention that cartographers bring to charting unknown continents. Through it all, the peculiar democracy of the sweating sickness remains its most troubling characteristic, the way it reduces all social distinctions to the same basic equation of moisture and time. The way it transforms kings and peasants into equal participants in a mystery that medieval medicine cannot solve and Renaissance learning cannot illuminate. In the geography of fever, all roads lead to the same destination, the discovery of what lies beyond the final hour, whether that destination proves to be dawn or something altogether more permanent. The fever carries you forward through centuries like a river flowing towards some distant sea. And suddenly you stand in a modern laboratory where fluorescent lights cast their sterile glow over specimens that would have mystified Tudor physicians. Vials of genetic material, microscope slides bearing the ghosts of ancient pathogens, computer screens displaying molecular structures that dance like crystallized fever dreams in the cold light of contemporary science. Here, 500 years after the sweating sickness claimed its first English victim, researchers still gather around conference tables, like medieval scholars debating angels and pinheads, their theories as elegant and ultimately as speculative as any Renaissance physician's discourse on the balance of humors. The plague that vanished as mysteriously as it arrived continues to haunt medical imagination, a puzzle piece that refuses to fit into any completed picture of infectious disease. On the laboratory's silent slab lies the first theory, hantavirus, that modern plague carried by rodents whose droppings transform into airborne death when disturbed by human habitation. The symptoms align with tantalizing precision: sudden onset, profuse sweating, cardiovascular collapse, the peculiar selectivity that spares some while claiming others. Yet something essential remains missing, some crucial element that would explain why this particular pathogen chose to terrorize Tudor England for exactly 66 years before vanishing without trace. Beside it rests the relapsing fever hypothesis, elegant in its simplicity, tick-borne spiritues that cycle through the bloodstream like clockwork, creating the intermittent outbreaks that mark the sweating sickness's appearances across decades of English history. The theory explains the fever's strange rhythm, its tendency to return after years of absence, but fails to account for the rapid mortality that distinguished it from other tick-borne diseases that physicians recognize and treat with antibiotics unknown to Renaissance medicine. The third specimen gleams with the oily sheen of ergot alkaloids, those compounds that transform innocent grain into hallucinogenic poison, that turn bread into a vehicle for madness and death. The theory whispers of contaminated rye, of wet summers that encouraged fungal growth, of peasants and nobles alike consuming their daily bread without knowing they ingested the chemical precursors to visions and perspiration, and the particular delirium that accompanies ergot poisoning. Yet ergotism follows patterns, the sweating sickness ignored, creating symptoms that differ from the Tudor plague's signature presentations. In the corner of this imaginary laboratory sits the influenza hypothesis, modest and persistent as the virus itself. The suggestion that some particularly virulent strain of flu, perhaps carried by the very swine that rooted through Tudor garbage heaps, evolved the capacity to kill with unprecedented swiftness before mutating into less lethal forms. The theory has the virtue of explaining the plague's disappearance, the way epidemic diseases burn through populations before exhausting their supply of susceptible hosts, but lacks the dramatic precision that made the sweating sickness so distinctive among recorded plagues. The laboratory's most intriguing specimen bears no label, containing only question marks suspended in preserving fluid like embryonic uncertainties waiting to be born. This represents the possibility that the sweating sickness was something entirely novel, a pathogen that emerged from the complex interactions between medieval warfare, international trade, and the particular environmental conditions of late 15th century Europe, only to vanish when those conditions changed beyond its capacity to adapt. Modern epidemiologists, those cartographers of disease, who map the movement of pathogens across populations with the same careful attention medieval astronomers brought to charting planetary motions, acknowledge that some mysteries resist even contemporary analytical methods. The sweating sickness belongs to that category of historical enigmas that leave tantalizing clues without providing definitive answers, that challenge the assumption that modern science can retroactively solve all ancient puzzles. You observe these theories with the detached curiosity of someone whose fever has granted access to perspectives unavailable to purely rational inquiry. Each hypothesis contains fragments of truth, while missing some essential element that would explain why Tudor courtiers and German merchants and English farmers all succumbed to the same mysterious malady that killed with clockwork precision before disappearing as completely as morning mist burned away by summer sunlight. The researchers in this imaginary laboratory speak in the specialized vocabulary of molecular biology and genetic sequencing, yet their fundamental position mirrors that of Renaissance physicians who prescribed bloodletting and herbal remedies for a plague they could not understand. Both groups confront the same essential mystery, the recognition that some aspects of human mortality resist even the most sophisticated attempts at comprehension and control. Perhaps the sweating sickness's greatest mystery lies not in its pathology, but in its timing. The way it arrived precisely when England stood poised between medieval and modern, when old certainties crumbled before new possibilities, when the very nature of disease and healing underwent transformations as dramatic as any political revolution. The plague served as a harbinger of an age when traditional answers would prove inadequate, when even learned men would be forced to admit the limits of their knowledge while continuing to seek understanding in the face of insurmountable uncertainty. As the laboratory vision fades and you feel yourself drawn back toward your Tudor chamber, you carry with you the recognition that your fever connects you not only to past sufferers, but to future investigators, researchers who will spend centuries trying to decode the mystery that unfolds now in your perspiring flesh, scholars who will debate your symptoms long after your bones have turned to dust, and your struggle has become merely another case study in the long history of medicine's encounter with the inexplicable. The fever carries you even further forward through time's current, depositing you in the sterile corridors of a 2025 research facility, where scientists in white coats bend over DNA sequencers like medieval scribes, illuminating manuscripts, their work guided by the soft hum of machines that can read the genetic poetry written in human cells with precision that would have seemed miraculous to Tudor physicians who diagnosed illness by examining urine in glass flasks. Here, in laboratories funded by governments that barely existed when the sweating sickness terrorized Europe, researchers have discovered something that makes the ancient plague suddenly, startlingly relevant to contemporary medicine. The genetic breadcrumbs they follow lead not just backward toward Renaissance mysteries, but forward into the sprawling constellation of symptoms that modern medicine calls myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, the shadow plague that haunts millions of 21st century patients with the same democratic indifference that characterized its Tudor predecessor. Sarah Chen, a virologist whose grandmother survived the 1918 flu pandemic, stares at data streams that flow across her monitor like digital waterfalls, each number representing a fragment of genetic code extracted from tissue samples preserved in medical archives since the 1950s. The samples carry no trace of the sweating sickness itself. That plague vanished too completely for modern science to capture its molecular signature. But they reveal something almost as intriguing: patterns of immune system dysfunction that echo through centuries, like genetic echoes in a vast canyon. The connection emerged gradually, like dawn breaking over disputed territory. Researchers studying long COVID, that modern specter that leaves patients weak and breathless months after their initial infection, began noticing parallels with historical accounts of post-epidemic illness. Tudor chroniclers, writing decades after the sweating sickness disappeared, described survivors who never fully recovered their strength, who remained vulnerable to fatigue and weakness that no Renaissance remedy could cure. Modern CFS patients, those contemporary sufferers whose illness science still struggles to understand, display immune system signatures that mirror what researchers imagine the sweating sickness might have left behind. Their T cells show patterns of exhaustion that suggest past battles with invisible enemies. Their mitochondria, those cellular power plants that fuel human energy, bear the scars of some ancient conflict between host and pathogen that never fully resolved into either victory or defeat. Dr. Chen's research team has identified genetic variants that seemed to predispose certain individuals to post-viral fatigue syndromes, polymorphisms, that might have determined who survived the sweating sickness and who did not. The same genetic lottery that produces contemporary patients, whose lives shrink to the size of their bedrooms, might have operated in Tudor England, sorting courtiers and merchants into categories of survival and surrender, according to molecular mathematics that no Renaissance physician could have imagined. The laboratory's most intriguing discovery involves autoimmune dysfunction, the way some people's immune systems, having fought off an initial infection, continue their battle long after the original enemy has departed, turning against healthy tissue with the misguided dedication of soldiers who never received orders to stand down. The phenomenon might explain why some sweating sickness survivors never fully recovered, why Tudor medical records speak of lingering weakness that persisted years after the acute illness passed. Modern researchers studying the aftermath of COVID-19, Epstein-Barr virus, and other infections that can trigger chronic illness have mapped neural pathways that might have been disrupted in Tudor plague survivors. The vagus nerve, that crucial communication highway between brain and body, shows signs of dysfunction in ME/CES patients that suggest their autonomic nervous systems never learned to regulate properly, after some ancient viral invasion rewrote their cellular programming. Dr. Chen pauses in her work to consider the profound irony that a plague which terrorized Renaissance Europe might hold keys to understanding contemporary illness that affects millions of patients whose symptoms would have been instantly recognizable to Tudor physicians. The profound fatigue, the weakness that makes simple tasks feel mountainous, the way exertion produces not the honest tiredness of healthy labor, but a poisonous exhaustion that can last for days or weeks. The genetic variants her team studies exist in populations across Europe and beyond, distributed according to patterns that mirror historical trade routes and population movements from the late medieval period. The sweating sickness, even in its absence, may have shaped the genetic landscape of contemporary illness in ways that researchers are only beginning to understand. Perhaps most remarkably, the laboratory's work suggests that some modern ME/CFS patients might be fighting echoes of battles their ancestors won, or lost, against the sweating sickness and similar historical plagues. Their immune systems bear the genetic memory of ancient struggles, their cellular machinery calibrated by evolutionary pressures that no longer exist, but continue to influence how their bodies respond to contemporary infections. As the vision of the 2025 laboratory fades, and you feel yourself drawn back toward your Tudor chamber, you carry with you a profound recognition. Your fever connects you not only to past sufferers and future researchers, but to contemporary patients whose struggles echo your own across the centuries. The sweating sickness may have vanished, but its genetic legacy persists in the DNA of millions who will never know they carry the molecular memories of Tudor England's strangest plague. The democracy of illness extends beyond any single epidemic, linking sufferers across time in ways that transcend the particular pathogens that trigger their symptoms. Your perspiration, beating on Tudor skin in candlelit darkness, shares something essential with the exhausted tears of modern patients, whose illness science still cannot fully explain, whose suffering validates the ancient truth that some mysteries persist across centuries, wearing new names, but maintaining their essential character as challenges to human understanding and endurance. The fever dream shifts like candlelight behind closed eyelids, and suddenly you find yourself observing the accumulated wisdom of centuries, not the grand theories of learned physicians, but the quiet, practical knowledge that emerges when ordinary people confront extraordinary mortality and discover what actually works when death arrives, wearing an unfamiliar mask. Roll your shoulders back. Let the tension flow from your neck like water, finding its natural course. The Tudor survivors, who lived to tell their stories, learned lessons that modern epidemiologists would recognize, though they lacked the vocabulary to explain why their instinctive responses proved more effective than the elaborate remedies prescribed by university-trained physicians who treated the sweating sickness as if it were just another imbalance of humors waiting to be corrected with leeches and Latin prayers. The first lesson, written in perspiration across 5 centuries of English history, isolation works, but not in the way that medieval minds understood quarantine. The families who survived intact were not those who barricaded themselves behind walls thick enough to stop armies, but those who learned the delicate mathematics of social distance, close enough to care for each other, far enough apart to avoid sharing the invisible vehicles that carried death from breath to breath, from touch to touch. Village records from the final outbreak in 1551 reveal a pattern that would seem familiar to anyone who lived through the plague years of the 21st century. Communities that survived were those that developed informal protocols for maintaining connection while minimizing contact. They spoke to neighbors across garden walls rather than gathering in alehouses. They left food at doorsteps rather than sharing meals. They found ways to offer comfort without offering contagion, the opportunities it needed to spread through populations, like wildfire, through dry timber. The open window doctrine, dismissed by learned physicians as dangerous foolishness, proved to be the most reliable survival strategy available to those who could not afford to flee to country estates. Fresh air, that simple element that costs nothing and requires no prescription, moved through chambers like an invisible broom, sweeping away whatever atmospheric conditions allowed the sweating sickness to thrive in the close quarters, where fear tends to concentrate itself into deadly potency. Tudor households that survived multiple outbreaks developed rituals that modern medicine would classify as effective infection control. The careful washing of hands in water, mixed with herbs that happen to possess antimicrobial properties. The burning of aromatic woods that may have served as primitive air purifiers. The separation of the sick from the healthy in ways that respected both the need for care and the mathematics of transmission that no Renaissance scholar could calculate, but every survivor learned to respect. Rumor control emerged as a survival skill as crucial as any medical intervention. Communities that managed information with the same careful attention they devoted to managing grain stores during famines were those that avoided the panic-driven behaviors that amplified the plague's reach. They learned to distinguish between useful warnings and the kind of fear-mongering that sent people fleeing from one infected area directly into another, carrying their terror and sometimes their illness like seeds scattered by desperate wind. The survivors developed an understanding of what modern medicine calls the stress-immunity connection, though they expressed it in the language of spiritual rather than physiological balance. Those who found ways to maintain hope without denying reality, who developed practices for managing anxiety without succumbing to either false optimism or paralyzing despair, seemed to possess some slight advantage in the biological lottery that determined who would perspire through the fever and emerge intact. Sleep, that fundamental requirement that Tudor physicians often overlooked in their focus on dramatic interventions, proved essential for those who survived the sweating sickness. The families who maintained regular rest patterns, who created environments conducive to the deep sleep that allows immune systems to function optimally, showed better survival rates than those who allowed fear to disrupt the ancient rhythms that govern cellular repair and restoration. Nutrition, limited though it was by the agricultural constraints of the 16th century, mattered in ways that went beyond simple caloric intake. Communities with access to varied diets, fresh herbs, preserved fruits, the occasional piece of fish or fowl, fared better than those subsisting entirely on bread and ale. The micronutrients that modern science can identify and measure provided advantages that Tudor survivors could observe but not explain. Perhaps most importantly, the communities that endured learned the art of collective resilience, the recognition that survival required not just individual health measures, but social structures that could function under extreme stress. They developed systems for caring for orphan children, for maintaining food distribution, for preserving the basic functions of community life, even when death reduced their numbers and fear tested their bonds. The window-borne hope that saved lives during the sweating sickness outbreaks teaches lessons that extend far beyond any particular plague, that survival often depends less on dramatic medical interventions than on the quiet accumulation of small, sensible practices, that communities thrive or perish based on their ability to balance individual safety with collective care, that wisdom emerges from experience rather than theory, from observation rather than speculation. As you lie in your Tudor chamber, feeling the fever work its way through your system like a tide that follows laws you cannot predict, but can learn to navigate, these lessons offer more than historical curiosity. They provide a framework for understanding that survival has always required the same fundamental combination of practical wisdom, social cooperation, and the kind of stubborn hope that refuses to surrender even when the odds seem calculated by mathematics, too complex for any mortal mind to comprehend fully. The window beside your bed stands open to night air that may carry healing, or may carry nothing more than the promise that morning will eventually arrive, bringing with it whatever resolution your fever has been preparing throughout these long hours of perspiration and prayer, of hallucination and clarity, of individual struggle played out against the vast backdrop of historical mystery that connects your chamber to every other room where someone has fought the same battle and discovered what lies beyond the final hour of uncertainty. Thames fog lifts. A single lantern reflects twice, then fades. You drift one final time between the practical wisdom and something deeper, where the fever has transformed into something almost sacred. The perspiration on your skin no longer feels like illness, but like the tears that time itself might shed when watching ordinary people discover extraordinary courage. The serving girl appears one last time, but now she wears your own face and the faces of everyone who has ever tended fever or been tended during the dark hours when breathing becomes a conscious choice. Her hands move like gentle rain, placing comfort where comfort is needed, offering presence where words have become inadequate. The physician's voice echoes from every century, speaking not in Latin, but in the universal language of those who heal what can be healed and witness what cannot. His remedies transform into something larger than medicine, something that might be called hope, crystallized into the shape of human persistence through the Thames fog that rises like the breath of sleeping giants. You see lanterns floating on water that might be the river that flows through London, or might be the stream that connects all chambers, or might be the stream that connects all chambers, where someone has ever fought the democracy of fever and discovered what lies beyond the final negotiation between flesh and spirit. Each lantern reflects twice, once in the water, once in the mist, creating duplicates that dance with their originals, like memories dancing with the present moment. Some reflections grow brighter as you watch others fade until only the ghost of light remains, suspended between what was and what might still become. The courtyard below your window fills with figures that cast no shadows because they have become the shadows of everyone who ever walked through valleys where even whispers echo like thunder. They move in patterns that spell out messages written in a script that dissolves before you can read the words, but leaves behind the feeling that someone somewhere is counting your breaths. Someone somewhere is counting your breaths and finding them precious. Your heartbeat becomes the rhythm of waves against shores that exist only in the space between one breath and the next. Each pulse carries the accumulated weight of all the stories that have ever ended with someone choosing to continue breathing until dawn decides who gets to witness its arrival. The tapestry tells its final story. King Arthur no longer draws his sword from stone, but from the heart of your own fever. The blade gleams with droplets. That blade gleams with droplets that might be sweat or might be the crystallized essence of every small victory that occurs when ordinary people discover they are stronger than they ever imagined possible. Somewhere a lullaby drifts through air stronger than they ever imagined possible. Somewhere a lullaby drifts through air that tastes of rosewater and the particular sweetness that comes when time slows to accommodate all the miracles that need witnessing. The melody carries fragments of every song that need witnessing. The melody carries fragments of every song that has ever been sung to comfort those who walk through darkness toward darkness toward darkness toward Tolth. A century, light the candle flame beside your bed burns with the steadiness of something that has learned to dance with its own reflection. The light casts no dancing shadows now, but instead illuminates your chamber with the kind of clarity that comes only when the ordinary world reveals its hidden architecture of connection and grace. Your fever reaches its final equilibrium, no longer hot or cold, but something between and beyond both temperatures. It has become the medium. Both temperatures. It has become the medium through which you understand that survival has always required the same fundamental combination of practical wisdom, stubborn hope, and the recognition that some mysteries resolve themselves not through understanding, but through simple endurance. 1 hour until dawn, or perhaps 1 heartbeat, or perhaps 1 century. Time has become completely elastic, stretching to contain all the dreams that need dreaming, all the prayers that need dreaming, all the prayers that need whispering, all the small acts of courage that occur when breathing becomes less an automatic function and more a conversation between will and flesh. The Thames fog lifts slowly, reluctantly, like a curtain being drawn back to reveal whatever stage awaits, slowly, reluctantly, like a curtain being drawn back to reveal whatever stage awaits. Behind the mist, the single lantern that has guided you through this night of fever and vision reflects one final time in water that might be the river or might be the tears that joy sheds, witnessing the kind of quiet heroism that occurs in chambers where someone chooses to keep breathing until light returns to chase away. Someone chooses to keep breathing until light returns to chase away the particular darkness that only fever can create. Dawn rose. The plague slipped away. Breathe slow and let history rest. The great clock chimes one final time, its bronze voice carrying across courtyards where morning light filters through mist that smells of dew rather than fever, of hope rather than perspiration. You have survived the night. Your fever breaks like a wave retreating from shore, leaving behind only the gentle warmth of sunlight through windows that stayed open when others sealed their chambers against imaginary threats. Your breathing settles into the natural rhythm of someone who has negotiated successfully with mortality and discovered that survival requires less drama than anyone expects, more patience than anyone hopes to need. The dampness on your skin dries slowly, reluctantly, like morning mist burning away under summer sun. What remains is simply yourself, tired, certainly, but intact in ways that matter more than the exhaustion that always follows great battles. Whether they are fought on fields or in the privacy of fevered chambers, the serving girl appears at your door one last time, but now her knock carries the particular lightness that comes when crisis passes, and ordinary life prepares to resume its ancient patterns. She brings water that tastes like water rather than liquid starlight, bread that smells of wheat fields rather than crystallized hope, the simple pleasure of hunger returning, of thirst that can be satisfied with earthly remedies, feels like the most profound miracle your body has ever accomplished. Through your window, you watch Whitehall Palace, awakening to a morning that will be remembered differently by everyone who lived through the night. Some chambers remain silent, their occupants having made the journey from fever to whatever lies beyond the final negotiation between flesh and spirit. But many windows show signs of movement, faces appearing to test the safety of daylight, voices calling across courtyards with the particular joy that comes when ordinary conversation resumes after hours of wondering whether speech itself might be interrupted by more permanent silence. The royal physician emerges from the palace's medical quarters, his leather bag hanging empty at his side. His remedies proved useless, as they always did when confronted with the sweating sickness. But something in his posture suggests he has learned lessons that no university could teach. Perhaps wisdom consists not in knowing how to cure every ailment, but in recognizing which mysteries require nothing more than careful observation and the kind of patient presence that honors both healing and surrender as equally valid responses to the democracy of human vulnerability. Roll your shoulders one final time. Let the last tension flow from muscles that have carried you through a night that tested every assumption you might have held about the nature of strength and endurance. You are part of a story now, not just your own tale of survival, but the larger chronicle of everyone who has ever discovered that courage often looks less like heroic declaration and more like the simple decision to continue breathing when breathing requires conscious effort rather than automatic response. The sweating sickness will return to England 4 more times before vanishing as mysteriously as it arrived, but you will not be there to witness its final bow. Your fever has granted you membership in the community of survivors, those who carry within their cells the molecular memory of negotiation with invisible enemies. You have learned that some battles are won not through conquest but through endurance, not through understanding but through the kind of stubborn persistence that chooses life, even when life offers no guarantees about the terms of its continuation. As morning light fills your chamber completely, washing away the shadows where hallucinations danced and fear took temporary residence, you understand that survival has taught you something valuable about the nature of time itself. Each moment contains enough space for everything that matters, for breathing, for witnessing, for the small acts of courage that occur when ordinary people discover they possess resources they never knew existed. The Thames flows past London's walls, carrying away the night's terrors and fears like debris swept downstream by currents that know the ancient secret. Everything passes, everything changes, and the morning that follows, even the darkest night, arrives with the reliable persistence of water, finding its way to the sea. Sleep comes easily now, the kind of rest that follows great exertion and greater relief. Your breathing deepens into the rhythm of someone who has earned the right to unconsciousness, who has paid whatever price the night demanded, and discovered that dawn, patient and inevitable, waited all along just beyond the horizon of fever and fear. Tomorrow night, we'll trace another forgotten fever through the corridors of history, perhaps the dancing plague that seized medieval towns in fits of inexplicable movement, or the English sweats that returned to haunt continental Europe long after England itself had found peace. Until then, let the rhythm of your own breathing carry you deeper into rest. You've survived this night's journey through Tudor chambers and fevered dreams, through the democracy of perspiration that connected palace to cottage, court to field, heart to heart across the centuries. If this quiet chronicle helped ease your passage towards sleep, consider leaving a gentle comment about which historical mystery you'd like to explore next. And if you're new to these midnight wanderings through forgotten stories, that subscribe button waits patiently for your touch. A small gesture that helps ensure these whispered histories continue to find their way to those who need them most in the quiet hours when the world sleeps, but curiosity remains awake. The candle beside your bed gutters low, as all candles must. The fever that carried you through Tudor England's strangest plague has run its course, leaving behind only the memory of moisture and the deeper understanding that some mysteries resolve themselves not through explanation, but through the simple passage of time. Close your eyes now. Let history settle into its proper place, not as an urgent crisis requiring your attention, but as a gentle companion, offering comfort in the darkness. The sweating sickness claimed its victims and departed, but you remain, breathing steadily in whatever century contains your bed, your blankets, your own private negotiation with the darkness that precedes all dawns. Other stories wait in tomorrow's shadows, other plagues and puzzles that shape the world you inherited. But tonight belongs to rest, to the particular peace that comes when fever breaks and morning light reveals that survival, quiet and unremarkable, proves to be the most profound victory of all. Sweet dreams, fellow wanderer, through history's forgotten corners. The Thames still flows past London's walls, carrying new stories toward the sea. But you have heard enough for one night. Sleep well. History never rests, but you should. Good night. Take care.